You're sitting down to watch what looked like just another regular season game between the Indiana Fever and the Phoenix Mercury. And by the time the final buzzer sounded, almost nobody was talking about the score anymore. Instead, every conversation in the basketball world shifted toward a handful of plays, a handful of moments where the contact on the court started to look like something more than just physical defense. And if you were watching live, you probably felt that shift happening in real time because the broadcast cameras kept finding their way back to the same replays over and over, from different angles, as if even the production crew sensed that something here needed a second look. That's the kind of moment we're talking about today. The kind that doesn't resolve itself when the game ends, but instead keeps building in the hours and days that follow. What makes this story worth slowing down for isn't just one foul or one frustrated reaction caught on a hot mic. It's the fact that the league itself, the WNBA, eventually stepped in with a formal suspension. And that's not something this league hands out casually. Think about that for a second. Fines happen constantly. Technical fouls get assessed and forgotten by the next news cycle. But an actual suspension? A player sitting out games as a direct consequence of what happened on the floor? That's rare enough to matter on its own. And the player at the center of it, Alyssa Thomas, wasn't some fringe rotation piece either. She just put up one of the more productive stat lines of her season in that very game. So before we get into what the league decided and why, you have to go back to what actually happened on the court, possession by possession, because that's where this entire story really begins. To understand why this moment carried so much weight, you have to rewind to before tip-off, because the context surrounding this matchup mattered just as much as anything that happened once the ball went up. The Phoenix Mercury came into this game with a record that put them near the bottom of the league standings, a team that had won only a handful of games all season and was generally viewed as overmatched against most of the WNBA's stronger rosters. The Indiana Fever, on the other hand, were dealing with their own set of pressures, anchored by a roster built around Caitlyn Clark, a player whose every game draws national broadcast attention and a level of scrutiny that's almost unheard of for a non-finals matchup. And that combination, a struggling Mercury team with little to lose facing a Fever team under a spotlight, set up a dynamic that you could feel building before the opening tip even happened. From the very first possessions, there was a physical tone to this game that stood out compared to a typical regular season matchup. You could sense it if you were watching closely. The way certain players positioned themselves a beat early, the way contact lingered just a fraction longer than it needed to on certain plays away from the ball. That's the kind of detail that's easy to miss in real time, but becomes impossible to ignore once you start reviewing the footage frame by frame. Alyssa Thomas, in particular, was playing with an aggressive physicality from the opening minutes, the kind of style that's long been part of her game and part of what makes her a tough matchup for any opponent. But as the game wore on, that physicality started showing up in moments that had less and less to do with where the basketball actually was. And that's exactly the detail that would end up mattering most once the league sat down to review what happened. Let's get specific, because vague descriptions don't do justice to what actually showed up on film. And the specifics are exactly what the league's review process focused on. There were multiple plays across the course of this game where contact occurred between Alyssa Thomas and Caitlyn Clark in spots on the court where the basketball simply wasn't. One sequence showed contact near Clark's upper body in a moment when she didn't have the ball and wasn't in any position to be making a play on it. Another sequence showed knee-to-knee or knee-to-body contact during a drive to the basket, the kind of contact that officials are specifically trained to watch for because of the injury risk it carries. Individually, any one of these plays might get explained away as the normal chaos of a physical basketball game. But that's not what the footage showed when you started stacking these moments next to each other. That's where things got interesting. Because once you line up multiple plays from the same game, involving the same two players, with the basketball demonstrably somewhere else on the court each time, the explanation of "it's just a physical game" starts to lose its footing. Think about what you're actually looking at when that happens. You're not looking at a series of unrelated, isolated incidents that all happen to look similar by coincidence. You're looking at a pattern. And patterns are exactly the kind of evidence that league offices weigh most heavily when they sit down to review conduct after the final buzzer. The on-court officials, working in real time at full speed, called what they called and let the game continue. But the league office, reviewing the same plays frame by frame, with the benefit of replay and time, clearly saw something that warranted a much stronger response. And that gap between what got called live and what got punished after the fact is exactly where this story picks up its next thread. Here's where it's worth pausing and asking a fair question, because not every hard play in basketball is evidence of something deliberate, and good analysis has to hold on to that distinction even while looking closely at troubling footage. Basketball is a physical sport. Players collide, bodies get tangled, fighting for rebounds, and contact that looks rough in isolation often has a completely reasonable basketball explanation once you understand the positioning and the read a defender was making. That's the benefit of the doubt that gets extended to most physical plays in most games, and it's the benefit of the doubt that got extended to plenty of contact in this particular game too. But benefit of the doubt has limits, and those limits get tested specifically when the same two players are involved in multiple plays in the same game, where the ball isn't anywhere near the contact. That's exactly the standard that separates competitive physicality from something the league is obligated to address, and it's worth letting that sink in for a moment. If a defender makes contact while contesting a shot, while fighting through a screen, while boxing out for a rebound, that's basketball, even when it looks rough on a replay. But when contact happens repeatedly in spots where there's no basketball-related explanation for it, when the same pattern shows up multiple times against the same opponent in the same game, that's no longer a string of coincidences. That's the kind of pattern that gets flagged by analysts, picked apart by fans frame by frame on social media, and eventually lands on the desk of a league office that has to decide whether what it's looking at crossed a line. And in this case, the league looked at exactly that pattern and decided that it had. So let's talk about the suspension itself, because the announcement carries more weight than a quick headline might suggest, and that's exactly the kind of detail that's easy to scroll past if you don't stop to think about it. The WNBA does not suspend players often. That's not opinion. That's just how the league has historically handled in-game conduct. Fines get issued regularly enough that they barely register as news. Technical fouls pile up over a season without much fallout, but an actual suspension, a player sitting out games entirely as a direct, formal consequence, is a different category of discipline altogether. It requires the league office to conclude that what happened wasn't just rough, wasn't just chippy, wasn't just two competitors playing with an edge, but crossed into conduct the league is obligated to respond to in a way that actually costs a player playing time. Think about what that means for a second, because a suspension isn't really about the games missed by one player. It's about what the league is saying on the record, in writing, in a formal announcement that becomes part of the institutional history of both the player and the league itself. When the WNBA suspends Alyssa Thomas, it isn't just punishing one performance in one game. It's drawing a public line and saying that the conduct on display was deliberate enough, repeated enough, and serious enough to warrant a consequence beyond anything a fine or a technical foul could deliver. And that's exactly the kind of signal that doesn't just affect Thomas. It ripples outward to every player, every coaching staff, and every team that has a game coming up against Caitlyn Clark or against any other player who might find themselves on the receiving end of similar treatment. That's the bigger story sitting underneath the suspension itself, and it's exactly where we're headed next. Now it's worth stepping back and giving credit where it's due, because Alyssa Thomas isn't a fringe player who barely factors into a game plan, and pretending otherwise would do a disservice to an honest breakdown of what happened. In this very game, the one that ended in a suspension, she put together one of the more complete statistical performances you'll see from anyone on either roster. She finished with 24 points on 12 of 17 shooting from the field, added 8 assists, and pulled down 4 rebounds, all in a single outing. That's the kind of stat line that, under any normal circumstances, would dominate the postgame conversation entirely on its own. She's long been known around the league as one of the most versatile, hard-nosed competitors in the WNBA. A player who affects winning in ways that don't always show up cleanly in a box score, and this game was a clear example of that kind of two-way impact on the offensive end. And that's exactly what makes this story so complicated, because you're not looking at a player with no real basketball value who got caught doing something reckless out of frustration. You're looking at a genuine difference maker who, in the very same game where she was putting together an efficient, productive, winning performance, was also engaging in the kind of contact that the league later determined crossed a line. Let that sink in for a second, because those two things existing in the same game, the brilliance and the suspension-worthy conduct, is part of why this story resonated the way it did. If it had been a marginal player making a desperate, reckless play late in a blowout, this conversation might have faded quickly. But because it was a core piece of the Mercury's identity, delivering one of her best games of the year, while also engaging in the conduct that triggered league discipline, it forces a harder question about intent, about strategy, and about what the Mercury as a team were actually trying to accomplish in that matchup. And that question is exactly where we're headed next. Let's zoom out from Alyssa Thomas individually and look at what this suspension means for the Phoenix Mercury as an organization. because losing a player of her caliber, even for a handful of games, lands differently depending on the team's overall situation. The Mercury came into this season already in a difficult spot, sitting near the bottom of the league standings with one of the lower win totals across the entire WNBA. They're a team that has, fairly or not, been described by plenty of analysts as lacking the overall talent depth to compete consistently with the league's stronger rosters night after night. So when a player like Thomas, someone who was clearly one of their most productive performers on a given night, gets pulled out of the lineup by suspension, that's not a minor inconvenience. That's a real competitive cost for a team that didn't have much margin to begin with. But here's where it gets a little more complicated, because Thomas wasn't operating in isolation out there. And plenty of the conversation around this game extended to her teammates as well, particularly Dia Bonner, who drew her own share of attention for physical play during the same matchup. And that raises a fair question worth sitting with. Was what happened a result of one player's individual approach to the game, or did it reflect something closer to a team-wide strategy for handling a high-profile opponent? If it's the former, then the suspension on its own addresses the core issue. If it's closer to the latter, then a single suspension might only be scratching the surface of a much bigger conversation about how this particular team chose to compete that night. Either way, the Mercury now have to deal with both the basketball fallout, a meaningfully weaker roster for however many games Thomas misses, and the reputational fallout, being the team at the center of the league's most talked about disciplinary decision in recent memory. And that reputational piece doesn't go away just because the suspension has already been handed down. Now, let's shift over to the other sideline. Because the conversation around this game wasn't only about what Phoenix did, it also became a conversation about how Indiana's own coaching staff managed the situation as it was unfolding. Stephanie White made a series of rotation decisions during this game that drew real scrutiny once people started looking closely at the minutes breakdown. At several points, Clark found herself sitting on the bench during stretches where she'd clearly built up rhythm and momentum, while the offense ran heavily through Kelsey Mitchell instead. In the first half alone, the gap was striking. Mitchell played all but a minute or so of available time, while Clark's minutes were noticeably more limited. That's the kind of detail that's easy to overlook in the moment, but becomes a much bigger talking point once you start asking what those minutes actually meant in context. Here's why that context matters so much, and it's worth letting this sink in before moving on. If the opposing team was engaging in the kind of physical targeting that led to a suspension, then every minute Clark spent on the bench was also a minute she wasn't exposed to that contact, and every minute she returned to the floor, the physical pressure resumed right along with her. Whatever the basketball logic behind White's rotation choices, intentional or not, those decisions carried a safety dimension that doesn't seem to have been part of the conversation in real time. That's exactly the kind of question that deserves a fair, honest look rather than a rush to blame. Was this simply a coaching staff trying different lineup combinations in a tough game? Or was it a rotation pattern that, intentionally or not, left their franchise player exposed to a level of physicality the coaching staff should have been managing more carefully? Either way, it's a question worth Indiana's front office asking internally, even as the league's suspension decision dominates the headlines. This brings us to maybe the most uncomfortable part of this entire story: the role of the officiating crew that was actually on the floor during the game itself. Because here's the thing about a suspension handed down days after the fact. It's a form of accountability, but it's accountability that arrives only after everything has already happened. The contact already occurred. Any physical toll it took on Clark already happened. The Fever already played through it and absorbed however many additional minutes of that physicality while it was going on. So if the league's own review process, working with the benefit of replay and unlimited time, concluded that the conduct was serious enough to warrant a suspension, the natural follow-up question is why the officials working the game in real time didn't call it that way as it was happening. That's not meant as a dig at the officiating crew specifically, because in-game officiating is an extraordinarily difficult job, made under real-time pressure, at full speed, without the benefit of multiple camera angles or slow-motion replay. But it does point toward a real gap worth talking about honestly. A flagrant foul called in the moment, or even an early warning conversation between officials and a player whose contact was drifting into questionable territory can stop a pattern before it repeats itself 5 or 6 more times over the course of a game. A suspension announced days later can't undo any of that. It can only mark after the fact that something should have been handled differently. And that gap between in-game enforcement and after-the-fact discipline is exactly the kind of structural issue that leagues have to wrestle with if they want to prevent this exact situation from playing out again in some future game against some other player under some other set of cameras. So where does that leave the league moving forward? Because a suspension, however significant, is really just the starting point of a longer conversation about what comes next. There are a few concrete things worth thinking through here, and they're worth taking one at a time rather than lumping them together as a single vague call for the league to do better. First, there's the officiating piece, making sure crews working future games involving high-profile matchups have clear, consistent guidance about what level of contact crosses the line from competitive physicality into something that needs to be stopped in real time, rather than reviewed and punished afterward. That's not about protecting any one specific player more than another. It's about applying a consistent standard that holds up under replay every single night. Second, there's the question of pattern recognition across games, not just within a single one. If film review after the fact can identify a clear pattern of targeted contact, that's useful information the league can carry forward, not just as a historical record, but as something that informs how future matchups get officiated and monitored. And third, there's the simple matter of transparency, making sure that when decisions like this suspension get made, the reasoning behind them is communicated clearly enough that players, coaches, and fans all understand exactly where the line is. That's the kind of clarity that benefits everyone in this league, not just the players who happen to draw the most national attention. Let that sink in for a second. A suspension closes one chapter, but it only matters in the long run if it actually changes how the next several games get played and officiated. And that's exactly the test this moment sets up going forward. Step back even further, and this entire situation fits into a much larger story about what it means to be the most closely watched player in the WNBA right now. Caitlyn Clark's presence has changed the commercial and cultural landscape of this league in ways that go well beyond any single box score. And that elevated attention cuts in two directions at once. On one hand, it's brought unprecedented broadcast numbers, sold-out arenas, and a level of mainstream interest that the league has been working toward for years. On the other hand, it also means every possession she's involved in gets dissected from multiple camera angles, replayed endlessly online, and held up against a standard of scrutiny that very few players in this league's history have ever had to deal with. That's exactly the environment this suspension played out in. And it's worth keeping that context in mind rather than treating this as an isolated basketball story. What this moment really signals, if you zoom out far enough, is a league still working through how to officiate and protect its biggest star in real time, while that star's success is simultaneously reshaping the league's entire financial and cultural trajectory. Every opposing team now has to think carefully about how they approach defending Clark, knowing that the league has shown, through this suspension, exactly where the line sits between hard-nosed defense and conduct that draws a formal consequence. That's the kind of calculation that ripples across every roster, every coaching staff, and every officiating crew assigned to a Fever game going forward. And if you've been following this story closely, you already know this isn't going to be the last time this exact conversation comes up, because as long as Clark remains the most watched player in the league, every physical possession involving her is going to get this same level of attention. So let's bring this all together, because there's a lot to hold on to here, and it's worth recapping it clearly before we close things out. A regular season game between two teams with very different trajectories turned into one of the most significant disciplinary stories of the WNBA season. Not because of the final score, but because of a pattern of contact that the league's own review process determined had crossed a clear line. Alyssa Thomas, coming off one of the more productive statistical performances of her season, ended up suspended. A rare and weighty decision in a league that doesn't hand those down lightly. And that suspension opened up a whole chain of further questions about the Mercury's approach as a team, about Stephanie White's rotation decisions and what they meant for Clark's exposure to physical contact, and about the gap between what officials can realistically call in real time versus what a league office can identify after the fact with the benefit of replay. None of these threads resolve neatly, and that's exactly the point. The suspension was real accountability, but it was accountability after the fact, not protection in the moment. And that distinction matters if the league wants to actually prevent something like this from happening again, rather than just respond to it once more after it already has. If you've made it this far, you clearly care about where this story goes next. And honestly, so do we, because this conversation isn't closing with one suspension. It's going to keep evolving as the season goes on, as more high-profile matchups come up, and as the league continues figuring out how to officiate and protect its biggest stars in real time. So if you want to stay on top of how this plays out, go ahead and subscribe, and drop a comment with what you think the league should do differently going forward, because this is exactly the kind of story that's going to keep coming back around.